Listen, NATO, I blocked your plan to control African airspace, the one that would give you complete aerial dominance over our continent. That era of foreign military control is over. I stopped you, and I will never allow it. It was your last mistake. Now get ready for our response. Let me tell you exactly how I destroyed Operation Sky Dominance. My defense minister called, "Mr. President, we intercepted NATO communications. They're planning something massive, Operation Sky Dominance. 15 military bases across Africa, complete airspace control. They're moving fast." I read the intercepted documents. NATO wasn't requesting permission. They were planning to take African airspace permanently. 15 bases, advanced radar networks, satellite surveillance, command centers coordinating operations across the entire continent. The plan assumed African consent wouldn't be necessary. Documents described us as regional partners who will accommodate strategic requirements. Translation: they expected us to surrender our airspace without question. I gave one order. I'm addressing Security Council personally. They want to control our airspace? They're going to hear from me directly. 24 hours later, I walked into UN Security Council chamber. Western ambassadors looked uncomfortable. They'd expected diplomatic protest, not African president confronting them face to face. Security Council President announced, "President Traoré has 11 minutes. 11 minutes. I smiled. 11 minutes to destroy NATO's entire African strategy. I began. Yesterday, this council's permanent members planned Operation Sky Dominance. 15 military bases across Africa. Complete aerial control. Most severe intrusion on sovereignty since colonization ended. I paused. Let that sink in. NATO determined that Africa, 54 sovereign nations, requires foreign military control of our airspace without asking, without negotiating, just planning to take it. Western ambassadors shifted uncomfortably. Let me address NATO's justification, counterterrorism. You claim African nations need NATO air support, but let's discuss actual terrorism threats and who creates them. I displayed data. Libya. NATO intervention 2011. Result: failed state, terrorist safe haven, regional instability, refugee crisis. You created the terrorism you now claim justifies controlling our airspace. French ambassador tried to interrupt. Point of order. I have the floor, you'll hear every word. I continued. NATO wants 15 bases. Let me name the locations from your intercepted documents. Ouagadougou, 30 kilometers from my presidential palace. Bamako, Niamey, N'Djamena, Dakar, Abuja, Nairobi, Addis Ababa. Every major African capital targeted. Why these locations? Not counterterrorism. Strategic control. You want bases near our governments, near our resources, near our decision-making centers. I revealed the real objectives. Your own documents state African airspace control enables rapid military deployment anywhere on continent, allows surveillance of African governments, provides platforms for intervention operations. This isn't counterterrorism. This is military occupation. This is neo-colonial control. This is NATO deciding African airspace belongs to Western powers. British ambassador looked increasingly uncomfortable. But here's what NATO didn't know. We've been coordinating alliance intelligence sharing. We detected your planning 6 months ago, tracked every survey flight, monitored every site assessment, documented everything. I displayed the evidence with deliberate precision. NATO conducted unauthorized reconnaissance over Burkina Faso airspace, 87 flights, all without permission, all without notification, all without diplomatic courtesy, all gathering intelligence for base construction, all violating our sovereignty before even requesting access, all proving NATO's contempt for African independence. I showed the first radar track. Flight 1, March 15th, 2024, 0347 hours, U.S. Air Force RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft entered Burkina Faso airspace from Niger, flew for 47 minutes over Ouagadougou region, conducted electronic surveillance, mapped radar installations, photographed military facilities, gathered intelligence on our air defense capabilities, never requested permission, never filed flight plan, never acknowledged our sovereignty, just violated our airspace, collected intelligence, left. I showed another track. Flight 2, March 22nd, 0412 hours, French Air Force C-160, Gabriel signals intelligence aircraft entered from Mali, flew for 39 minutes, intercepted military communications, mapped communication networks, identified command centers, gathered signals intelligence, no permission, no notification, no respect, just violation. I continued methodically. Flight 3, March 29th, British RAF RC-135W rivet joint. Flight 4, April 5th, German Air Force, due 228 maritime patrol aircraft modified for reconnaissance. Flight 5, April 12th, another U.S. aircraft. Flight 6, April 19th, French again. Flight after flight, week after week, month after month, 87 total violations, 87 acts of sovereignty violation, 87 demonstrations of NATO contempt. I displayed the complete flight log, every flight documented, every violation recorded, every aircraft identified, every route tracked. We have radar tracks showing exact flight paths. We have satellite confirmation showing aircraft positions. We have recordings capturing communications. We have photographic evidence showing reconnaissance activities. Complete documentation of NATO violating African airspace while planning to control it permanently. I showed satellite imagery. This is U.S. reconnaissance aircraft over Ouagadougou, March 15th. Photographed from our satellite surveillance. Aircraft clearly visible, flight path documented, sovereignty violation proven. This is French aircraft over western Burkina Faso, March 22nd. Same documentation, same violation, same contempt. I displayed communication intercepts. This is pilot communication from U.S. Reconnaissance flight. Target area reached. Beginning surveillance run. No opposition detected. African air defense appears minimal. They're not just violating our airspace, they're assessing our defenses, planning how to dominate us, discussing how weak we are, demonstrating their contempt. I showed more intercepts. French pilot communication, surveillance complete, intelligence gathered, recommend this location for future base construction. Minimal local resistance expected. They're not just flying over our territory, they're selecting where to build bases, planning where to station troops, deciding where to occupy our land. Without asking, without permission, without respect. I revealed NATO planning documents. These documents were obtained through alliance intelligence operations. They show NATO's base site selection process. Ouagadougou region identified as optimal location for command and control facility. Why? Because their unauthorized reconnaissance flights showed minimal air defense capability and favorable terrain for base construction. They violated our airspace to plan our occupation. I displayed site assessment reports. NATO conducted ground surveys after aerial reconnaissance. Teams entered Burkina Faso on tourist visas. Actually, military engineers assessed potential base locations, evaluated construction requirements, estimated costs, all based on intelligence from unauthorized flights. All preparing for occupation we never approved, all demonstrating systematic contempt for our sovereignty. I showed construction timelines. NATO planned to begin base construction in Burkina Faso within 6 months of securing agreements. They put agreements in quotes because they didn't plan to negotiate. They plan to present us with fait accompli. We've already conducted reconnaissance, already selected sites, already designed facilities, already allocated budget. Just sign here. That was their plan. Reconnaissance first, planning second, permission never. Then I made the announcement that would change everything. 26 African nations reject Operation Sky Dominance. Coordinated continental response. No NATO bases. No airspace control. No military occupation. Unified African rejection. This is not isolated response from Burkina Faso. This is continental decision. This is African unity. This is collective sovereignty defense. Western ambassadors started conferring urgently. I could see panic in their body language, frantic whispers, urgent gestures, shocked expressions. They hadn't expected this. They'd expected Burkina Faso alone, maybe 1 or 2 supporters. Not 26 nations, not continental unity, not coordinated rejection. Their strategy was collapsing in real time. Mali announces it will not accept NATO bases on its territory. President Assimi Goïta stated this morning, Mali's airspace belongs to Mali. Mali's territory belongs to Mali. Mali's sovereignty is not negotiable. We reject NATO's Operation Sky Dominance completely. Mali stands with continental sovereignty. Niger rejects airspace control proposals. President Mohamed Bazoum declared, Niger will not surrender control of our airspace to foreign military alliance. We will not allow NATO bases on our soil. We will not permit foreign military occupation disguised as partnership. Niger stands with African unity. Chad refuses military installations. President Mahamat Déby announced, Chad has closed French military bases. We will not open NATO bases. We will not accept foreign military presence. We will not surrender our sovereignty. Chad stands with continental defense. Senegal stands with continental sovereignty. President Macky Sall proclaimed, Senegal supports African solutions to African security challenges. We reject foreign military domination. We embrace continental cooperation. Senegal stands with African independence. Ghana rejects foreign military control. President Nana Akufo-Addo stated, Ghana will not accept NATO bases. We will not surrender our airspace. We support African Airspace Sovereignty Initiative. Ghana stands with Africa. Kenya refuses military occupation. President William Ruto declared, Kenya's sovereignty is not for sale. Our airspace is not available for foreign military control. We stand with continental unity. Kenya stands with African dignity. Ethiopia rejects NATO expansion. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced, Ethiopia will host African Continental Air Defense Command. We will not host NATO bases. We choose African sovereignty over foreign military presence. Ethiopia stands with continental coordination. South Africa opposes military domination. President Cyril Ramaphosa stated, South Africa rejects neo-colonial military arrangements. We support African-led security solutions. We stand with continental independence. South Africa stands with African liberation. 26 nations united in saying, no. Algeria, Angola, Benin, Botswana, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Comoros, Congo, Djibouti, Egypt, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Eswatini, Ethiopia, Gabon, Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Kenya, Lesotho, Libya, Madagascar, Malawi, Mali, Mauritania, Mauritius, Morocco, Mozambique, Namibia, Niger, Nigeria, Rwanda, Sao Tome and Principe, Senegal, Seychelles, Sierra Leone, Somalia, South Africa, South Sudan, Tanzania, Togo, Tunisia, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe. Continental unity, African solidarity, collective sovereignty. But we didn't just reject, we built alternative. African Airspace Sovereignty Initiative, Continental Coordination System, our radar networks, our communications, our control centers, our personnel, our technology, our systems, our sovereignty. Complete African ownership, total continental control, absolute indigenous capability. I detailed the system with pride. South Africa contributing advanced radar technology, not buying from Western manufacturers. Indigenous South African radar systems developed by African engineers, manufactured in African facilities, deployed across African continent. Technology transferred to all participating nations. Capacity building for continental defense. South African expertise shared freely. African solutions for African security. Nigeria providing training facilities. Nigerian Air Force training centers open to all alliance members. Pilot training, radar operator training, air traffic controller training, command center personnel training, technical specialist training, comprehensive training programs. Nigerian expertise shared continually. African knowledge for African capability. Ethiopia hosting Continental Air Defense Command headquarters. New facility constructed in Addis Ababa, $200 million investment. State-of-the-art command center. Advanced communication systems, sophisticated coordination capabilities, representatives from all member nations, real-time continental awareness, instant coordination capability. Ethiopian leadership in continental security. Kenya supplying logistics infrastructure. Kenyan logistics network supporting continental operations, supply chain management, equipment distribution, maintenance support, technical assistance, comprehensive logistics capability. Kenyan efficiency enabling continental defense. Egypt contributing air defense systems. Egyptian military providing surface-to-air missile systems, radar installations, communication equipment, technical expertise. Egyptian capabilities strengthening continental security. Algeria sharing surveillance technology. Algerian intelligence providing satellite surveillance capabilities, electronic warfare systems, signals intelligence equipment, technical knowledge. Algerian expertise enhancing continental awareness. Morocco offering cyber defense capabilities. Moroccan cybersecurity protecting continental communications, network security, data protection, cyber warfare defense. Moroccan technology securing continental systems. Every nation participating, every country contributing, every government committed, some providing technology, some offering training, some supplying logistics, some sharing expertise, some contributing funding, everyone participating meaningfully. Continental cooperation, African unity, collective capability. Within 3 months, operational, not planning, not designing, operational, radar coverage across 26 nations. Integrated radar networks detecting all aircraft movements, real-time tracking, continuous monitoring, complete awareness, communication networks connecting air forces, secure communications, encrypted channels, instant coordination, coordination center managing continental surveillance, 24/7 operations, professional staff, advanced technology, complete system, African-owned, African-operated, African-controlled. We don't need NATO bases. We have our own capabilities. We don't need foreign control. We have continental coordination. We don't need your permission. We have our sovereignty. We don't need your technology. We have our systems. We don't need your training. We have our expertise. We don't need your presence. We have our independence. I shifted to direct challenge, voice hardening. NATO claims this is about security. Let's discuss actual security threats. France maintains military bases across Africa without genuine host nation consent, not partnership, occupation, not cooperation, domination, not mutual agreement, unilateral presence. France has military bases in Djibouti, Chad, Ivory Coast, Gabon, Senegal, all maintained through economic pressure, all representing neo-colonial military presence. Where are sanctions against France? Where is Security Council condemnation? Where is international accountability? This council authorized Libya intervention in 2011, Resolution 1973, no-fly zone to protect civilians. Result, complete state collapse, government destroyed, country fractured, militias everywhere, refugees fleeing, regional instability spreading, terrorist safe havens created, weapons proliferating, violence continuing. 12 years later, Libya remains failed state. Where is responsibility for that disaster? Where is accountability for that catastrophe? Where are consequences for that failure? NATO doesn't care about African security. NATO cares about NATO control. Operation Sky Dominance proves it. 15 bases across Africa. Complete airspace dominance over continent. This isn't partnership. This is domination. This is occupation. This is neo-colonialism with military uniforms. Military occupation disguised as partnership. Security cooperation disguised as domination. Counterterrorism disguised as neo-colonialism. I looked directly at camera, speaking past ambassadors to global audience. These sanctions against Burkina Faso, punishment for rejecting NATO control. We closed foreign military bases. France was angry. We expelled intelligence networks. CIA was furious. We built Continental Alliance. NATO was threatened. We defended sovereignty. West was offended. That's our crime. Not threatening peace. Defending independence, not destabilizing region, unifying continent, not violating human rights, protecting sovereignty. If this council truly cared about international peace, where are sanctions against nations with actual violations? Israel occupying Palestinian territories for decades, documented war crimes, verified human rights abuses, proven aggression, no sanctions, Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen, civilian casualties, humanitarian catastrophe, regional instability, no sanctions. Myanmar military killing Rohingya, documented genocide, verified ethnic cleansing, proven crimes against humanity, no sanctions. But those nations cooperate with Western interests. Support Western policies, align with Western positions, so no consequences, no accountability, no justice. Burkina Faso's crime isn't threatening peace. Burkina Faso's crime is independence. We chose African solutions over Western dictates. We selected continental cooperation over foreign control. We preferred sovereignty over submission. That's our crime. Independence. I made final declaration with absolute conviction. Therefore, Burkina Faso rejects these sanctions as illegitimate, based on false accusations without evidence, imposed by hypocritical nations with worse records, representing abuse of UN system for neo-colonial purposes. We will not comply, we will not submit, we will not accept, we reject completely. And we're not alone. 26 African nations reject these sanctions, continental unity refusing neo-colonial punishment, alliance solidarity opposing unjust measures, collective sovereignty defending African independence. We stand together, we reject together, we resist together. Gasps around chamber, shocked expressions, urgent whispers. Nations don't reject Security Council sanctions, countries don't declare non-compliance. Governments don't challenge Council authority directly. But I wasn't finished, I had more to say. African Counterintelligence Alliance stands with Burkina Faso. Mali will not enforce sanctions against Burkina Faso. Niger declares these sanctions illegitimate and refuses compliance. Chad rejects sanctions as neo-colonial punishment and will not implement them. Senegal stands with Burkina Faso against unjust sanctions. Ghana refuses to enforce illegitimate measures. Kenya rejects neo-colonial punishment. Ethiopia stands with continental sovereignty. South Africa opposes unjust sanctions. 26 nations united in rejecting this abuse of power. Continental solidarity, African unity, collective defiance. The chamber erupted into absolute chaos. Unprecedented challenge to Security Council authority unfolding in real time. Ambassadors shouting across the horseshoe table. Diplomats conferring frantically with their capitals. Western powers sitting in visible shock, faces pale, hands trembling. French ambassador dropped his pen. American ambassador pushed back from table. British representative stood halfway up, then sat back down, uncertain what to do. This had never happened before in 79 years of United Nations history. Never in UN history had this many nations simultaneously rejected Security Council sanctions with such coordinated defiance. Never had Continental Bloc challenged Council authority so directly and so publicly. Never had African nations demonstrated such unity against Western pressure with such absolute conviction. Never had developing nations coordinated such systematic resistance to permanent member power. Historic moment unfolding, unprecedented defiance being broadcast globally, revolutionary challenge to post-World War II international order being witnessed by entire world. Security Council President Albanian ambassador holding rotating presidency banged gavel repeatedly. Order, order in the chamber. Nobody listened. African ambassadors were standing, some applauding, some conferring, all energized. Western ambassadors were making urgent phone calls, some to capitals, some to intelligence agencies, all seeking guidance for situation with no precedent. Asian ambassadors were watching carefully, some taking notes, some recording, all recognizing historic significance. Latin American ambassadors were conferring among themselves, some nodding approval, some expressing concern, all understanding implications for their own sovereignty struggles. Russian ambassador was smiling slightly, recognizing Western discomfort. Chinese ambassador maintained neutral expression, but was clearly pleased by Western embarrassment. Indian ambassador was nodding slowly, appreciating challenge to Western-dominated system. Brazilian ambassador was leaning forward, engaged completely, recognizing moment's importance for Global South. Non-aligned nations were watching intently, understanding that power dynamics were shifting before their eyes. Western media cameras were capturing everything. CNN broadcasting live, BBC covering extensively, Al Jazeera providing continuous coverage, every major international outlet showing Security Council chamber in chaos, global audience watching African president challenge Western power directly, millions seeing continental unity demonstrated visibly, billions witnessing historic defiance of neo-colonial system. Social media exploded simultaneously, Twitter trending number African unity within minutes, Facebook posts sharing my speech excerpts, YouTube videos analyzing my statements, Reddit threads discussing implications, TikTok clips showing African ambassadors standing, Instagram stories celebrating continental solidarity, global conversation erupting about African sovereignty and Western power. My time is not expired, I stated firmly, voice cutting through chaos. I have 2 minutes remaining, and I'm going to use every second, every moment, every opportunity to speak truth to power. Security Council President banged gavel again. President Traoré, please conclude. I have 2 minutes remaining according to procedures you established. I will use them completely. My voice was steel, unmovable, uncompromising. Western ambassadors exchanged glances. They wanted to stop me, wanted to cut off my microphone, wanted to end this embarrassment. But they couldn't. UN procedures were clear. I had time remaining. Cutting me off would prove my point about their contempt for rules when rules didn't serve their interests. First point, and listen carefully because this changes everything. These sanctions will fail. Not because Burkina Faso is strong enough to resist alone. We're not. We're poor country. Limited resources, small economy, vulnerable to pressure, GDP of only $19 billion, population of 22 million, military budget of $400 million. By any objective measure, we're weak. Individually, we cannot resist Western economic pressure. Individually, we cannot withstand Security Council sanctions. Individually, we cannot survive international isolation. I paused, letting that honesty sink in, admitting vulnerability, acknowledging weakness, making my next point more powerful. But we're not alone, because Africa is united, 26 nations standing together, not just declaring support, actually coordinating response, actually sharing resources, actually implementing collective resistance. Mali providing alternative banking access, Niger maintaining trade channels, Chad ensuring supply routes, Senegal offering financial cooperation, Ghana sharing economic resources, Kenya coordinating logistics, Ethiopia hosting coordination meetings, South Africa providing technical assistance. 26 nations creating collective strength from individual weakness. Continental coordination defeating individual pressure through systematic cooperation. What you can do to one nation you cannot do to 26 nations acting together. What pressure works against isolated country fails against coordinated bloc. What sanctions achieve against individual economy cannot achieve against integrated continental response. Alliance solidarity overcoming isolated vulnerability through mutual support. Collective strength achieving what individual weakness cannot through unified action. These sanctions will fail because African unity is stronger than Western pressure, because continental coordination is more resilient than individual vulnerability, because collective resistance is more powerful than isolated weakness, because 26 nations together can withstand what one nation alone cannot, because African solidarity creates capability that African isolation lacks, because unity transforms weakness into strength, because coordination converts vulnerability into resilience, because cooperation changes impossibility into achievement. I look directly at Western ambassadors. You designed these sanctions to isolate Burkina Faso, to make example of us, to show other African nations what happens when you defy Western power, to demonstrate that sovereignty has consequences, to prove that independence brings punishment, but your sanctions are achieving opposite effect. Instead of isolating Burkina Faso, you're unifying Africa. Instead of making example of us, you're creating continental solidarity. Instead of showing consequences of defiance, you're demonstrating necessity of unity. Instead of proving sovereignty brings punishment, you're proving unity brings strength. Your sanctions are failing before they even begin. Second point, and this exposes fundamental truth about international system. These sanctions expose UN system failure. Security Council dominated by 5 permanent members: United States, Russia, China, France, United Kingdom, 5 nations, out of 193 UN member states, 5 nations controlling Security Council, 5 nations holding veto power, 5 nations determining international peace and security, 5 nations deciding which violations matter and which don't, 5 nations choosing which countries get sanctioned and which get protected. All former colonial powers or their allies. United States, former British colony that became colonial power itself. Russia, former empire that colonized Central Asia and Eastern Europe. China, former empire that dominated East Asia. France, colonial power that occupied quarter of Africa. United Kingdom, colonial power that controlled quarter of world's population. All 5 permanent members have history of colonialism, imperialism, or both. All 5 benefit from current international system. All 5 resist reform that would reduce their power. All using council to protect interests rather than promote peace. United States uses veto to protect Israel from accountability despite decades of occupation and documented war crimes. Russia uses veto to protect Syria from consequences despite chemical weapons use and civilian targeting. China uses veto to protect North Korea from pressure despite nuclear weapons development and human rights violations. France uses veto to protect its interests in Africa despite military interventions and neo-colonial policies. United Kingdom uses veto to support American positions despite questionable legality and justice, all preventing genuine reform that would make Council representative and democratic. Proposals for additional permanent members, blocked. Suggestions for veto reform, rejected. Ideas for regional representation, dismissed. Plans for democratic decision-making, ignored. Every reform proposal that would reduce permanent member power gets vetoed by permanent members protecting their power. System designed to prevent its own reform. Structure built to maintain its own injustice. All maintaining 1,945 power structure despite world transformation. System designed for post-World War II, world when most of Africa was colonized, when most of Asia was occupied, when most of Latin America was dominated. System created when 51 nations founded UN, now applied to 193 member states. System established when colonialism was legal, now maintained when colonialism is condemned. System built when racial hierarchy was accepted, now preserved when racial equality is proclaimed. 1,945 power structure governing 2025 reality. Post-war system managing post-colonial world. Imperial structure controlling independent nations. Obsolete for 2025 reality where power is distributed differently, where populations are located differently, where economies are structured differently, where threats emerge differently. Africa has 1.4 billion people but no permanent Security Council seat. Asia has 4.6 billion people but only one permanent member. Latin America has 650 million people but no permanent representation. Meanwhile, Europe has 750 million people but 2 permanent members plus effective control over United States vote. Population distribution doesn't match power distribution. Economic contribution doesn't determine decision-making authority. Regional representation doesn't reflect global reality. Unrepresentative of global population, with 5 permanent members representing 1.8 billion people, making decisions for 8 billion people globally. Undemocratic in structure with veto power allowing single nation to override wishes of 192 other nations. Unjust in operation with permanent members protecting allies from accountability while punishing enemies for lesser violations. System is broken fundamentally. Council is tool of Western powers primarily. UN needs fundamental reform urgently. These sanctions prove system is broken by showing how Security Council punishes African sovereignty while protecting Western violations. Prove Council is tool of Western powers by demonstrating how permanent members use sanctions to enforce neo-colonial control. Prove UN needs fundamental reform by revealing how current structure enables injustice rather than promotes peace. Evidence is undeniable. Pattern is clear. Conclusion is obvious. System must change or system will collapse. Third point, and this reveals unintended consequence of your actions that you never anticipated and cannot reverse. These sanctions accelerate African independence in ways you cannot control or prevent. Every unjust sanction strengthens continental unity by proving necessity of collective resistance to all African nations watching. Every abuse of power builds African resolve by demonstrating Western contempt for sovereignty to every African leader. Every neo-colonial punishment increases determination for sovereignty by showing cost of dependence to every African citizen. Every Western pressure creates African resistance by revealing alternative to submission to every African government. Let me explain exactly how your sanctions are achieving opposite of your intentions. You designed these sanctions to isolate Burkina Faso economically, diplomatically, politically. You intended to make example of us, to show other African nations what happens when you defy Western power, to demonstrate that sovereignty has consequences, to prove that independence brings punishment, to teach lesson that compliance is safer than defiance. That was your plan. That was your strategy. That was your intention. But here's what actually happened. Here's the unintended consequence. Here's the result you didn't anticipate. Every African nation watching these sanctions understands message differently than you intended. They don't see dangerous rebel being punished. They see sovereign nation being attacked. They don't see example to avoid. They see threat to resist. They don't see lesson about compliance. They see warning about dependence. Your sanctions are teaching lesson, just not lesson you intended. Mali watched these sanctions and concluded, if Burkina Faso can be sanctioned for closing foreign military bases, Mali can be sanctioned for same reason. We closed French bases. We're vulnerable to same punishment. We need alliance protection. Mali didn't become more compliant. Mali became more committed to alliance. Your sanctions strengthened continental unity. Niger watched these sanctions and concluded, if Burkina Faso can be sanctioned for expelling intelligence networks, Niger can be sanctioned for same reason. We expelled CIA operatives. We face same threat. We need collective security. Niger didn't become more cooperative. Niger became more dedicated to continental coordination. Your sanctions built African resolve. Chad watched these sanctions and concluded, if Burkina Faso can be sanctioned for building continental alliance, Chad can be sanctioned for participating. We're alliance members. We're potential targets. We need unified response. Chad didn't become more submissive. Chad became more determined for sovereignty. Your sanctions increased determination for independence. Every unjust sanction strengthens continental unity by proving necessity of collective resistance through demonstrated threat. African nations see, individual countries are vulnerable. Isolated nations can be pressured. Alone, we're weak. Together, we're strong. Collective resistance is necessary. Continental coordination is essential. Unity is survival. Your sanctions prove this, demonstrate this, teach this. Every day, every action, every pressure. Every abuse of power builds African resolve by demonstrating Western contempt for sovereignty through systematic pattern. African leaders see, West doesn't respect African sovereignty. Western powers don't value African independence. International institutions serve Western interests. UN system protects Western power. Security Council enforces neo-colonial control. Your sanctions demonstrate this, prove this, show this, repeatedly, consistently, undeniably. Every neo-colonial punishment increases determination for sovereignty by showing cost of dependence through painful experience. African governments see, dependence creates vulnerability. Economic reliance enables pressure. Political alignment requires submission. Military cooperation demands compliance. Sovereignty requires independence. Your sanctions show this, teach this, prove this. Clearly, painfully, definitively. Every Western pressure creates African resistance by revealing alternative to submission through forced innovation. African nations discover, continental trade can replace Western commerce. Regional banking can substitute for Western finance. Alliance security can replace Western military. African systems can function without Western approval. Independence is possible. Your sanctions reveal this. Enable this. Create this. Unintentionally. Ironically. Completely. You think sanctions will weaken us by destroying our economy, isolating our government, pressuring our leadership into submission or collapse. Actually strengthening us by forcing continental cooperation that creates new economic systems, requiring collective resistance that builds new political structures, demanding unified response that develops new security capabilities. Every pressure you apply forces us to build alternatives. Every sanction you impose requires us to create new systems. Every punishment you inflict demands we develop independence. You're not weakening us. You're forcing us to become stronger. You're not destroying our economy. You're forcing us to build continental economy. You're not isolating our government. You're forcing us to create continental coordination. Let me detail exactly how this works. You freeze our assets in Western banks. You think this destroys our financial capability. Actually, this forces us to establish continental banking system. Mali, Niger, Chad, Senegal, Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa create alternative banking network. African Development Bank expands services, regional banks coordinate operations, continental financial system emerges. Your asset freeze doesn't destroy our finances, it creates African financial independence. You ban our officials from traveling to Western countries. You think this isolates our government diplomatically. Actually, this forces us to strengthen African diplomatic networks. We increase meetings with African leaders. We expand cooperation with Asian nations. We develop relationships with Latin American countries. We build partnerships with Middle Eastern governments. Your travel ban doesn't isolate us. It diversifies our diplomatic relationships. You embargo arms sales to our military. You think this weakens our defense capability. Actually, this forces us to develop indigenous weapons production. We establish African arms manufacturing. We create continental defense industry. We build weapons development programs. We produce our own military equipment. Your arms embargo doesn't weaken our defense, it creates African military independence. You restrict trade with our economy. You think this destroys our commercial capability. Actually, this forces us to expand continental trade. We increase commerce with African nations. We develop regional trade networks. We create continental supply chains. We build African economic integration. Your trade restrictions don't destroy our economy. They create African economic cooperation. You think pressure will divide us by making example of Burkina Faso, scaring other nations into compliance, preventing solidarity through intimidation. Actually unifying us by proving necessity of coordination, demonstrating danger of isolation, showing power of unity through successful resistance. Every attempt to divide us unifies us more. Every effort to scare nations brings them closer. Every action to prevent solidarity creates stronger bonds. You're achieving opposite of your intentions. You're creating what you tried to prevent. You're building what you tried to destroy. Your sanctions were supposed to make example of Burkina Faso that scared other nations. See what happens when you defy us? See the consequences of sovereignty? See the cost of independence? Don't be like Burkina Faso. Stay compliant. Remain dependent. Accept our control. That was supposed to be the message. That was supposed to be the lesson. That was supposed to be the result. But actual message African nations received was completely different. See how West attacks sovereignty? See how they punish independence? See how they use international institutions against Africa? We need to stand together. We need to coordinate resistance. We need to build collective security. That's the actual message. That's the real lesson. That's the actual result. Mali saw your sanctions and moved closer to alliance. Niger saw your pressure and strengthened coordination. Chad saw your punishment and increased cooperation. Senegal saw your actions and enhanced solidarity. Ghana saw your measures and expanded support. Kenya saw your sanctions and deepened commitment. Ethiopia saw your pressure and reinforced unity. South Africa saw your punishment and strengthened resistance. Every nation you tried to scare became more committed to alliance. Every government you tried to intimidate became more dedicated to continental unity. Every leader you tried to pressure became more determined for sovereignty. You're proving necessity of coordination through your actions. Every sanction shows, alone we're vulnerable, together we're protected, individual nations can be pressured, united continent can resist, isolation is dangerous, coordination is essential. Your sanctions prove this better than any speech, demonstrate this more effectively than any argument, show this more clearly than any evidence. You're demonstrating danger of isolation through your pressure. Every action shows, isolated nations get sanctioned, coordinated blocs get respected, individual countries get punished. United continents get power, alone is vulnerable, together is strong. Your pressure demonstrates this constantly, proves this repeatedly, shows this undeniably. You're showing power of unity through our successful resistance. 26 nations standing together, continental coordination defeating your sanctions, collective resistance overcoming your pressure, alliance solidarity achieving what individual nations cannot, unity creating strength, coordination building power, cooperation enabling victory. Your sanctions are showing this. Your pressure is proving this. Your punishment is demonstrating this. You think punishment will submit us by imposing economic costs, creating political isolation, generating popular discontent that forces government change or policy reversal, actually liberating us by breaking psychological dependence on Western approval, ending economic subordination to Western systems, achieving political independence from Western control through forced self-reliance and continental cooperation. You think economic costs will force submission. You calculate. Burkina Faso GDP is small. Economy is vulnerable. Trade is limited. Resources are constrained. Economic pressure will work. Government will submit. Leadership will comply. Sanctions will succeed. That's your calculation. That's your assumption. That's your mistake. Actually, economic costs are breaking our psychological dependence on Western systems. For decades, African nations believed, we need Western trade. We require Western investment. We depend on Western aid. We cannot survive without Western economic support. This psychological dependence was more powerful than actual economic reality. This mental subordination was more limiting than real economic constraints. Your sanctions are breaking this psychological dependence, forcing us to discover we can trade with each other, we can invest in ourselves, we can develop without Western aid, we can survive independently, we can thrive continentally. You think political isolation will force compliance. You calculate Burkina Faso needs international legitimacy. Government requires diplomatic recognition. Leadership wants international respect. Political isolation will work. Government will change policy. Leadership will reverse position. Sanctions will succeed. That's your calculation. That's your assumption. That's your mistake. Actually, political isolation is ending our economic subordination to Western systems. For decades, African nations believed, we need Western diplomatic support. We require Western political approval. We depend on Western international backing. We cannot succeed without Western political endorsement. This economic subordination was maintained through political pressure. This financial dependence was enforced through diplomatic control. Your sanctions are ending this economic subordination, forcing us to discover we can coordinate diplomatically among ourselves. We can build political systems independently. We can create international legitimacy continentally. We can succeed without Western approval. You think popular discontent will force government change. You calculate sanctions will hurt population. People will suffer economically. Citizens will blame government. Popular discontent will grow. Protests will emerge. Government will fall or comply. That's your calculation. That's your assumption. That's your mistake. Actually, your sanctions are achieving political independence from Western control through demonstrated Western hostility. African populations see West is attacking our sovereignty. Western powers are punishing our independence. International institutions are being used against us. Our government is defending us. Our leaders are protecting our interests. Our sovereignty is under attack. This creates popular support for government. This generates citizen backing for leadership. This produces national unity against external threat. Your sanctions aren't creating discontent with government. They're creating anger at West. They're producing support for sovereignty. They're generating determination for independence. You're breaking psychological dependence through forced self-reliance. We cannot depend on Western systems that attack us. We cannot rely on Western institutions that sanction us. We cannot trust Western powers that punish us. We must build our own systems. We must create our own institutions. We must develop our own capabilities. Your sanctions force this. Your pressure requires this. Your punishment demands this. You're liberating us from psychological dependence, freeing us from mental subordination, releasing us from psychological colonialism. You're ending economic subordination through required alternatives. We cannot use Western banks that freeze our assets. We cannot access Western markets that restrict our trade. We cannot depend on Western investment that demands political compliance. We must create African banks. We must develop African markets. We must build African investment. Your sanctions require this. Your pressure demands this. Your punishment forces this. You're ending our economic subordination, breaking our financial dependence, achieving our economic liberation. You're achieving political independence through demonstrated necessity. We cannot depend on international system that sanctions us unjustly. We cannot trust Security Council that abuses its power. We cannot rely on UN that serves Western interests. We must build continental political systems. We must create African international institutions. We must develop independent diplomatic networks. Your sanctions prove this necessity. Your pressure demonstrates this requirement. Your punishment shows this imperative. You're achieving our political independence, creating our diplomatic liberation, enabling our sovereign freedom. These sanctions are accelerating African independence faster than any other action could, more completely than any other policy would, more permanently than any other event might. You designed sanctions to prevent independence. You're actually accelerating independence. You intended sanctions to maintain dependence. You're actually ending dependence. You planned sanctions to preserve control. You're actually destroying control. Unintended consequences. Historical irony. Strategic failure. Complete. Total. Absolute. These sanctions are accelerating exactly what you tried to prevent. African independence. Economic independence through continental trade replacing Western commerce. Political independence through collective decision-making replacing Western dictates. Military independence through alliance coordination replacing Western bases. Psychological independence through sovereignty assertion replacing colonial mentality. Complete independence through systematic resistance replacing neo-colonial dependence. Every sanction you impose, we create alternative system. You freeze assets, we establish continental banking. You ban travel, we coordinate African transportation. You embargo arms, we develop indigenous weapons. You restrict trade, we build regional commerce. You isolate diplomatically, we strengthen continental relations. Your sanctions force us to build exactly what we needed: independent African systems replacing Western-dependent structures. History will record that Western sanctions against Burkina Faso in 2025 accelerated African independence more than any other single event since decolonization. We'll show that your attempt to punish sovereignty actually promoted sovereignty. We'll demonstrate that your effort to prevent unity actually created unity. We'll prove that your sanctions designed to maintain control actually ended control. Unintended consequences. Historical irony. Strategic failure. Fourth point, and this reveals your true situation. These sanctions reveal NATO desperation. You're losing influence in Africa systematically and irreversibly. Countries closing your bases. Mali closed French bases. Niger closed American bases. Burkina Faso closed French bases. Chad closed French bases. 4 countries, dozens of bases, thousands of troops, all expelled. Nations expelling your intelligence officers. Burkina Faso expelled 43 Mossad operatives. Mali expelled French DGSE officers. Niger expelled CIA personnel. Chad expelled intelligence agents. Systematic expulsion of foreign spies. Governments rejecting your military presence. 26 nations rejected Operation Sky Dominance. Continental opposition to NATO expansion. Unified refusal of foreign military control. People demanding your departure. Popular protests against French presence. Demonstrations against American bases. Public opposition to foreign military. Citizens demanding sovereignty. Your control is slipping visibly. Your dominance is ending measurably. Your era is finishing inevitably. So you use sanctions desperately, because other methods failed completely. Because military bases are closing permanently. Because intelligence networks are destroyed systematically. Because continental unity is forming irreversibly. Because African independence is emerging unstoppably. Sanctions are admission of weakness, not demonstration of strength. Desperation, not power. Last resort, not first choice. Acknowledgement of failure, not assertion of control. I stood for final minute, voice rising with conviction. This council can impose sanctions, can freeze assets in Western banks, can ban travel to Western countries, can embargo arms from Western manufacturers, can restrict trade with Western economies. You have that power. Security Council has that authority. International law grants you that capability. I acknowledge this reality. I recognize this power. I understand this authority. But you cannot break African unity, cannot destroy continental coordination, cannot eliminate alliance solidarity, cannot prevent African sovereignty, cannot stop African independence, cannot reverse African liberation. You can punish economically, but you cannot control politically. You can pressure financially, but you cannot dominate strategically. You can sanction legally, but you cannot submit psychologically. African unity is stronger than your sanctions. Continental coordination is more powerful than your pressure. Collective sovereignty is more resilient than your punishment. Time expired. 2 minutes used completely. Every second employed. Every moment maximized. Truth spoken. Power challenged. History made. These sanctions are unjust, based on lies. These sanctions are hypocritical, imposed by criminals. These sanctions are illegitimate, violating UN Charter principles, and these sanctions will fail. Because Africa is united. Because Africa is strong. Because Africa is free. Burkina Faso rejects them. Africa rejects them. History will reject them. Future will condemn them. Justice will overturn them. Truth will expose them. I looked at camera one final time. Not at ambassadors, not at diplomats, at Africa, at our people. To African people, your sovereignty is defended, your leaders stand with you. Your unity is strong, your future is independent, your freedom is protected. These sanctions cannot stop us, this pressure cannot break us, this punishment cannot submit us. We are united. We are strong. We are free. To NATO, your Operation Sky Dominance is dead. Your 15 bases will never be built. Your airspace control is rejected completely. Your military occupation is refused absolutely. We built our own system. African Airspace Sovereignty Initiative is operational. We defend our own airspace. We control our own sovereignty. We protect our own security. We don't need you. We don't want you. We reject you. I walked out. Didn't wait for Security Council response. Didn't stay for diplomatic discussion. Didn't participate in procedural debate. Just delivered statement and left. 11 minutes that changed everything. 11 minutes that challenged Western power. 11 minutes that united Africa. 11 minutes that defended sovereignty. 11 minutes that made history. African ambassadors stood immediately, applauding, not polite diplomatic applause, genuine appreciation, enthusiastic support, following me out of chamber. Mali's ambassador first, then Niger's representative, Chad's ambassador, Senegal's representative, Ghana's ambassador, Kenya's representative, Ethiopia's ambassador, South Africa's representative, one by one, 26 African ambassadors, continental walkout, unified protest, historic demonstration, Security Council chamber half empty, Western ambassadors sitting in shock, French ambassador pale, American ambassador conferring urgently with aides, British representative reviewing notes frantically, German delegate making phone calls, authority challenged fundamentally, legitimacy questioned directly, power structure confronted openly. They didn't know how to respond. This had never happened before. Nothing in diplomatic protocol covered this situation. No precedent existed for this level of defiance. They were paralyzed. I held press conference immediately. UN headquarters, international media assembled, cameras everywhere, global audience watching. 11 minutes ago, I addressed Security Council about unjust sanctions against Burkina Faso, exposed NATO's Operation Sky Dominance, challenged Western hypocrisy, united Africa against neo-colonial abuse of UN system. 26 African ambassadors just walked out of Security Council chamber. Continental solidarity demonstrated visibly. Unified rejection shown publicly. Africa standing together against injustice. This is unprecedented. This is historic. This is revolutionary. Within hours, global reaction exploded. China issued statement. China questions sanctions legitimacy. No evidence provided. No investigation conducted. Process appears politically motivated. Russia expressed concerns. Russia notes sanctions against Burkina Faso lack proper justification. Concerns about Security Council being used for political purposes. India criticized process. India questions sanctions procedure. African nation sanctioned without clear evidence. Sets dangerous precedent. Brazil opposed approach. Brazil concerned about sanctions against Burkina Faso. Appears to punish sovereignty rather than address genuine threats. Global South solidarity building. Developing nations recognizing pattern. Western powers using international institutions to punish independence. NATO tried desperately to salvage Operation Sky Dominance. Proposed partnership framework emphasizing cooperation. Offered cooperation agreements stressing mutual benefit. Suggested mutual arrangements highlighting shared interests. Diplomatic language. Softer tone. Different approach. Same objective. Control African airspace. I responded publicly and directly. NATO failed to control African airspace through Operation Sky Dominance. 15 bases rejected. Complete control refused. Military occupation denied. Now trying through negotiation. Offering partnerships. Suggesting cooperation. Proposing arrangements. Answer is still no. We built our own system. African Airspace Sovereignty Initiative is operational. We don't need NATO bases. We don't need foreign control. We don't need your partnership. We have our sovereignty. Within 3 months, Operation Sky Dominance was completely dead. Not postponed, not delayed, not modified. Dead, finished, terminated. No bases established anywhere in Africa. Not in Burkina Faso, not in Mali, not in Niger, not in Chad, not in Senegal, not in any of the 15 targeted locations. 0 bases constructed, 0 facilities opened, 0 military installations created, nowhere in Africa, no airspace control achieved over any African nation, not over Burkina Faso, not over Mali, not over Niger, not over Chad, not over any alliance member, zero control established, zero authority exercised, zero dominance achieved over any African country, no military occupation accomplished in any African country, not in West Africa, not in East Africa, not in North Africa, not in Southern Africa, not anywhere on continent, zero occupation achieved, zero foreign military presence established, zero NATO troops deployed in any African nation. African sovereignty defended successfully through coordinated continental resistance, 26 nations standing together, alliance members supporting each other, collective security protecting everyone, continental coordination defeating NATO expansion, unity achieving what isolation could not, cooperation creating strength from individual weakness, solidarity transforming vulnerability into resilience. African sovereignty defended, protected, preserved successfully. Continental unity proven effective through systematic demonstration, not theoretical, not rhetorical, actual, proven, demonstrated, 26 nations coordinating intelligence sharing, real-time threat notification, instant communication, continuous cooperation, continental unity working, functioning, succeeding, effectively. Collective resistance achieved victory through sustained opposition, not partial success, not limited achievement, complete victory, total success, absolute triumph. NATO expansion stopped. Foreign military control prevented. Neo-colonial occupation defeated. Collective resistance winning. Succeeding. Achieving. Victory. African Airspace Sovereignty Initiative became fully operational within 3 months as promised. Not planning stage, not development phase, fully operational, actually functioning, completely working. Radar coverage across 26 nations detecting all aircraft movements, real-time tracking, continuous monitoring, complete awareness, continental surveillance functioning, communication networks connecting all member air forces, secure channels, encrypted communications, instant coordination, continental communications working, coordination center managing all continental operations, 24-hour staffing, professional personnel, advanced technology, continental command functioning, continental coordination working perfectly through systematic cooperation, intelligence shared instantly, threats identified immediately, responses coordinated rapidly, operations executed effectively, not theoretical coordination, actual cooperation, real integration, genuine unity, working, functioning, succeeding perfectly. Unified defense functioning effectively through integrated systems, not separate national defenses, unified continental defense, integrated capabilities, combined forces, coordinated operations, single defensive system, continental defense, working, operating, functioning effectively. Indigenous capabilities proven completely through demonstrated performance, not dependent on Western technology, not reliant on foreign systems, not requiring external support. Indigenous African technology, developed by African engineers, manufactured in African facilities, operated by African personnel. Indigenous capabilities, proven, demonstrated, validated, completely. African solution to African security implemented successfully, not Western solution imposed, not foreign system adopted, African solution created, by Africans, for Africans, serving African interests, protecting African sovereignty, defending African independence, African solution, working, succeeding, achieving, security. Our radar networks scanning African airspace continuously, not NATO radars, not Western systems. Our radars, African-owned, African-operated, African-controlled, detecting all aircraft, tracking all movements, monitoring all activities, our radar networks, functioning, operating, protecting, our communications connecting all forces instantly, not NATO communications, not Western networks, our communications, African developed, African maintained, African secured, linking all members, coordinating all operations, enabling all responses, our communications, working, connecting, coordinating, our control centers managing all operations professionally, not NATO command centers, not Western facilities, our control centers, African built, African staffed, African directed, coordinating surveillance, managing responses, directing operations, our control centers, operating, managing, commanding. Our personnel operating all systems expertly, not NATO personnel, not Western operators. Our personnel, African trained, African experienced, African professional, monitoring radars, managing communications, directing operations. Our personnel, working, operating, succeeding. Our technology powering all capabilities effectively, not NATO technology, not Western systems. Our technology, African developed, African manufactured, African maintained, enabling surveillance, supporting communications, powering operations. Our technology, functioning, working, succeeding. Our systems defending all airspace completely, not NATO systems, not Western defenses. Our systems, African created, African integrated, African operated, protecting sovereignty, defending independence, securing airspace. Our systems, working, defending, protecting. Our sovereignty maintained absolutely through our capabilities, not granted by NATO, not permitted by West. Our sovereignty, African defended, African protected, African maintained. Through our systems, through our personnel, through our technology, our sovereignty, defended, protected, maintained. NATO faced strategic failure of historic proportions unprecedented in modern military history, not tactical setback, not temporary delay, strategic failure, complete defeat, total collapse. Of historic proportions, unprecedented scale, unparalleled scope. Never before had NATO faced such comprehensive rejection. Never before had military alliance been denied expansion so completely. Never before had Western military power been refused so systematically. Historic proportions, unprecedented failure, complete defeat. Decades of planning destroyed in months through coordinated African resistance. Not years of planning. Decades. NATO had been planning African expansion since 1990 seconds. Studying African airspace since 2000s. Designing Operation Sky Dominance since 2010 seconds. 30 years of planning. 30 years of investment. 30 years of preparation. Destroyed. Eliminated. Terminated. In 3 months, through African coordination, through continental unity, through collective resistance, decades of planning, destroyed, wasted, lost. Billions in projected investment wasted completely through African rejection, not millions, billions. NATO had budgeted $15 billion for Operation Sky Dominance, $8 billion for base construction, $4 billion for equipment installation, $3 billion for personnel deployment, $15 billion allocated, budgeted, planned, wasted, lost, eliminated completely, through African refusal, through continental rejection, through unified opposition, billions in investment, wasted, lost, gone. Complete loss of African airspace access through continental coordination, not partial access, not limited presence. Complete loss, total denial, absolute exclusion. NATO cannot operate in African airspace, cannot conduct reconnaissance, cannot perform surveillance, cannot execute operations, cannot maintain presence, complete loss, total denial, absolute exclusion of African airspace access, through continental coordination, through alliance cooperation, through unified defense, total failure of military expansion through African unity, not partial failure, not limited setback, total failure, complete defeat, absolute collapse. NATO cannot establish bases, cannot deploy forces, cannot station personnel, cannot create presence, cannot achieve expansion, total failure, complete defeat, absolute collapse of military expansion through African unity, through continental solidarity, through collective resistance, absolute defeat of neo-colonial ambitions through African independence, not temporary setback, not partial defeat, absolute defeat, complete failure, total collapse. NATO cannot control African airspace, cannot dominate African security, cannot occupy African territory, cannot impose Western military presence, cannot achieve neo-colonial ambitions, absolute defeat, complete failure, total collapse of neo-colonial ambitions through African independence, through continental sovereignty, through unified resistance. I am Ibrahim Traoré, military officer who fought for liberation, president of Burkina Faso who defends sovereignty, continental leader who unites Africa, NATO planned Operation Sky Dominance to control African airspace systematically. 15 bases across strategic locations. Complete aerial surveillance over continent. Total military dominance over Africa. Systematic control of African security. I blocked it completely through coordinated continental response. Organized alliance rejection. Coordinated diplomatic opposition. Built African alternative. Achieved complete blockage. NATO wanted 15 military bases across Africa in strategic locations: Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, Bamako in Mali, Niamey in Niger, N'Djamena in Chad, Dakar in Senegal, Abuja in Nigeria, Nairobi in Kenya, Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, Johannesburg in South Africa. 15 bases, thousands of troops, complete infrastructure, total presence. I rejected them all through continental coordination. Organized unified opposition, coordinated systematic refusal, achieved complete rejection. NATO expected African compliance based on historical patterns, expected individual nations to accept under pressure, expected economic threats to force agreement, expected diplomatic isolation to compel submission, expected military intimidation to generate compliance, expected African weakness, expected continental division, expected historical patterns to continue. I delivered continental defiance through alliance coordination, organized collective resistance, coordinated unified opposition, demonstrated African strength, delivered complete defiance. NATO thought they'd control our airspace through military superiority, thought advanced technology would dominate African skies, thought military bases would ensure control, thought Western power would guarantee compliance, thought African weakness would enable domination, thought control was inevitable. I built African alternative through continental cooperation, organized indigenous capabilities, coordinated African technology, developed continental systems, built complete alternative. NATO assumed African weakness based on economic indicators, assumed poor nations couldn't resist, assumed limited resources prevented opposition, assumed small militaries ensured compliance, assumed economic dependence guaranteed submission, assumed African weakness. I demonstrated African strength through continental unity, showed collective power, displayed coordinated capability, proved unified strength, demonstrated complete strength. I don't accept foreign military control over African territory, don't surrender airspace to foreign powers, don't allow occupation by foreign forces, don't submit to pressure from Western powers, don't compromise sovereignty for economic benefits. I defend independence through continental coordination, build alternatives through African cooperation, unite Africa through alliance leadership, protect sovereignty through collective security, achieve victory through unified resistance. NATO's plan, blocked completely through coordinated opposition, their bases, rejected totally through unified refusal, their control, refused absolutely through continental resistance, their operation, destroyed permanently through systematic opposition, their expansion, defeated conclusively through African unity. We stopped you through continental coordination. We will never allow it through permanent vigilance. Your last mistake underestimating African unity. Our permanent victory defending African sovereignty. Your failed Operation Sky Dominance. Our successful defense African Airspace Sovereignty Initiative. Your wasted planning decades of preparation. Our achieved sovereignty continental independence. Operation Sky Dominance is dead, buried in history's graveyard of failed imperial ambitions, buried alongside other failed attempts to control Africa, finished like colonial occupation before it, dead like apartheid before it, terminated like formal colonialism before it, dead, buried, finished, forever. African airspace belongs to Africa through continental defense, belongs to African nations through collective security, belongs to African people through unified resistance, belongs to Africa, not to NATO, not to West, not to foreign powers, to Africa, through our systems, through our capabilities, through our sovereignty. Continental coordination is operational through systematic cooperation, is operational every day, is operational continuously, is operational permanently. Real-time intelligence sharing, instant threat notification, coordinated response capability, continental coordination, operational, functioning, working. Sovereignty is defended through collective security, is defended every moment, is defended continuously, is defended permanently. against all threats, against all pressure, against all interference. Sovereignty, defended, protected, maintained. Independence is protected through unified resistance, is protected constantly, is protected systematically, is protected permanently, against neocolonialism, against military occupation, against foreign control. Independence, protected, preserved, secured. Unity is proven through demonstrated success, is proven conclusively, is proven undeniably, is proven permanently. 26 nations coordinating, continental cooperation functioning, collective resistance succeeding. Unity, proven, demonstrated, validated. Victory is achieved through African strength, is achieved completely, is achieved permanently, is achieved absolutely. NATO expansion stopped, foreign control prevented, sovereignty defended. Victory achieved. 1. Complete. Mission complete. Objective achieved. Victory won. Sovereignty defended. Independence protected. Unity proven. Africa prevails. Always. Forever. Permanently.